Hey everyone, back again. Today we're going to talk about Baudrillard and Deleuze and Guattari. So I'm doing this because the Baudrillard versus Foucault one was pretty popular, so I figured you'd want more of that kind of thing. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to look at it in terms of Baudrillard contra Deleuze, specifically how they differ in terms of the simulacrum. And then from there, I'm going to move into discussing Baudrillard against Deleuze and Guattari. Now, before jumping into that, if you want to follow me, you can do that at Instagram at theory_and_philosophy. If you want to see mostly pictures of my cats, if you want to help me out, you can do that by sharing, liking, subscribing. That all helps a lot. If you want to help monetarily, you can do that via Patreon or PayPal. If you want, obviously no pressure. If you're listening to this in podcast form, you can find the YouTube version, which has video. Or if you're listening to this in the YouTube form, you can find only the audio in podcast form wherever you get podcasts pretty much, and there shouldn't be any ads there. And if you go and do that, leave me 5 stars, comment, review, that would all help me out a lot. Now, I don't want to waste any more of your time. Let's get into this. Now, Baudrillard is not the only person to write on the simulacrum. Deleuze wrote about it quite a bit, and they have pretty conflicting ideas about what the simulacrum is. So out of the book, or at least in the appendix of Logic of Sense by Deleuze, there's an essay titled Plato and the Simulacrum, in which he makes a pretty interesting argument about Plato's relationship to the simulacrum. But in it, he extracts or kind of develops his own approach to the simulacrum. And I'm going to lay that out here, and I'm going to then contrast it with how Baudrillard views it. So for Deleuze and Plato, he identifies that in Plato, that is, Deleuze identifies in Plato, that there's a distinction to be made between the copy and the simulacrum. So the copy actually has some kind of connection to resemblance, whereas the simulacrum is essentially a copy without resemblance. So in Baudrillard's work, the idea of the simulacrum is a copy of a copy. Pretty simply, the reproduction of something that is already reproduced. Whereas for Deleuze, it's not just a copy of a copy, but it is a copy of a copy that has lost resemblance to what might be the original thing, which is an interesting point of distinction. So in order to illustrate this, he gives the example of God creating humankind in its image. And this is, of course, an idea we've had for a long time, that humans are made in God's image. So humans are a copy of God in that way. Now they become simulacra for Deleuze as soon as they sin. When they sin and they then move away from God in their likeness. That is, they move from, in his words, a moral attachment to the thing they're representing into an aesthetic one. So it becomes not about what the image stood for, but it becomes copying the image for the sake of the image itself, which is obviously opens up to a kind of what he calls polyvocality. Now, as some of us may know, and I haven't done this text by Plato yet, nor have I done Derrida's interpretation of it yet, but Plato had a pretty turbulent relationship with writing. He was very clear in his own writing that writing is what would affect memory in a pretty bad way, yet he wrote everything he did down, so I don't know how you square that, but anyways. But writing is the first scene of, well, I guess in the case of God, humans sinning would be the first scene. But Deleuze focuses on writing as a site for simulacrum, because writing opens up a certain polyvocality into newness that can become detached from its kind of previous instantiations or the thing it was meant to resemble. So in his words, in writing and simulation, it is connected to intensities that divide into one another while changing their form. So there is possibility opened up with the simulacrum. The simulacrum opens up a certain possibility. Now, Deleuze doesn't celebrate the simulacrum in that way, because we might have the the impression, oh, great, deterritorialization, rhizomatic flows, moving away from a so-called moral order in favor of an aesthetic one. Deleuze doesn't want us to immediately celebrate this. So moving from Plato and the Similacrum, from Logic of Sense, into Anti-Oedipus, now we get Deleuze and Guattari's interpretation of the Similacrum as a tool mobilized by the despot to code and to overcode the world. And this comes out for the despot in the form of writing that allows them to essentially deterritorialize the various codes of the primitive regime so as to give things meaning that they otherwise wouldn't have. So this is a kind of deterritorialization, even though it is overcoding. So the despot rips up the land, demarcates it, says, okay, this area is for that area is for that. They put up borders and fences and whatever in order to code the world, but it is a coding that depended upon the ripping up of that world, the kind of deterritorialization of the world to instill new codes. So they do this with the aid of the Similacrum. So, and if you've listened to any of my episodes on 1,000 Plateaus, you'd know that that is Deleuze and Guattari, have a pretty ambiguous relationship to deterritorialization. It isn't necessarily a good thing. It can be used in favor of despotic overcoding. So the Similacrum in that way is a lot more, I guess, for them, isn't necessarily good, at least, as it's connected to writing. Now for them, schizoanalysis is the process of uncovering the kind of flows that can be found within writing, within the Similacrum, that would otherwise, from the surface, look like they do not have such flows. So the example they give as the kind of preeminent, maybe I will just say final stage of the Similacrum is something like Oedipus, that comes to stand for virtually everything as a kind of territorial overcoding, but that, came about surely through these various deterritorializations that they try to uncover throughout the course of Anti-Oedipus. So on the surface, for them, there's a kind of homogeneous veneer to the Similacrum, while the task for them, and this comes out in schizoanalysis, is to uncover the flows, the kind of polyvocality, the heterogeneity underneath that homogeneous veneer, that homogeneous surface. So what does Baudrillard think? Baudrillard's the opposite. So in a lot of ways, they're very similar. That is, Deleuze and Baudrillard, very similar in terms of their approach to the Similacrum. For the most part, they both think that the Similacrum has always been on the scene. The Similacrum they have a pretty ambiguous relationship to it. That is, they both think it could be a positive thing, both think it as housing a certain potential to some extent, both thinking that, there's still mystery within the Similacrum, but it's in the differentiation between what is immediately presented by the Similacrum and what exists underneath that I think, and I should have prefaced this is just my own thoughts on this, and can't wait to hear what people have to say. But for Baudrillard, instead of the surface of the Similacrum being a kind of homogeneous sect and the underbelly being heterogeneous, Baudrillard says it's the opposite. It's actually reversed. Where in the age of the Similacrum for Baudrillard, we think of advertising, we think of a kind of explosion of categories, an explosion of objects, an explosion of scenes, a kind of what he calls the obscenity of communication, of information that overwhelms us. And underneath it is not a kind of emancipatory heterogeneity. If anything, it's a more, reductive idea about reality. So this might explain one thing why, many of us have a tendency to look upon technology as though it's like going to bring about our demise. And, it's just about getting back to nature, getting underneath the Similacrum to reality. Now, Baudrillard doesn't see that as a good thing to do, because he's very suspicious about what this reality actually is. It doesn't house a kind of liberatory potential to get through the simulacrum to what exists beneath it, because that, as we all know from simulacrum and simulation, the simulacrum is that which hides that there's nothing beneath it. Like, it is all there is. So it's in that way that they are different. Deleuze sees the potential to get to these kind of hidden heterogeneous underbelly, where Baudrillard's a little bit more skeptical. And he thinks, for the most part, and this is me, that you have to work with the simulacrum to some extent, not in a kind of like reformist way, but it's about recognizing how within these kind of simulacral spaces, there are still the remnants of enchantment, mystery, seduction. That, if you want more on that, I've done a whole bunch of videos on Baudrillard. Now, in terms of the political project, so now I want to compare not just Baudrillard and Deleuze, but Baudrillard and Deleuze and Guattari. Baudrillard is very suspicious of this attempt to deterritorialize, to embrace these kind of rhizomatic flows. Because for Baudrillard, he's like, well, that seems to really resemble, because he sees the simulacrum as a kind of embracing of heterogeneity. He's like, that seems to really resemble the kind of logic of this kind of postmodern logic of endless flows, obscenity, just going wherever you want. In other words, just following the logic of late capitalism, like, its tendrils just carving through the earth. Baudrillard kind of levels this critique, and he never had a whole book on it, and he doesn't really mention Deleuze all that much throughout all of his 40 books. But in Forget Foucault, he talks about the way that Deleuze and Guattari seem to hinge a whole lot upon this kind of liberatory potential. And it is decidedly individualistic. Like, it's all about emancipating your flows, embracing your own lines of flight or whatever, in order to, break from the rigid boundaries of, these molar aggregates or whatever, these strata that limit people. And Baudrillard doesn't want to do that. And in response, or I guess as a way to critique them, he says that of the schizo, that they themselves are a pure screen, a pure absorption and resorption on the surface of the influent network. So he doesn't see a kind of liberatory potential there. If there is liberation associated with it, it's one that works in the favor of the system. That is, a system that wants to bring everything on stage, to make everything visible, to allow things to move and flow, that Baudrillard is very, very skeptical of. Additionally, Baudrillard says that Deleuze and Guattari hinge a whole lot upon production. So we think of it in terms of desiring production, these kind of machinic movements that don't move by corresponding to a want or need, or by following that desire, but instead their desire is in their wanting to produce and to make connections and flows between other machines. It's not a desire of lacking, or it's not because of lack that they open themselves up to this. It is because that is just what they're open to. That's what they have to be doing. Now, as early as The Mirror of Production, Baudrillard's fourth book in the early 70s, The Mirror of Production, he identifies the same insistence in Marx, where he says, and I'm not quoting verbatim here, Marx hinges everything on production. For Marx, it's all about producing, making people more efficient, getting to the use value of things so as to open up this kind of true human potential. Where Baudrillard's like, what is that? What is this true human potential? And I believe the same could be extended to Deleuze and Guattari, where he pretty much says, what is this thing that you call desiring production? It seems to be quite, indicative of a certain movement of capitalist accumulation or capitalist production that, you can't just dissociate the two as though it's a purely liberatory one. So it's, I want to say that this isn't so much like what Baudrillard actually says, it's my interpretation of what he would say. And he would be very skeptical, worried that, Deleuze and Guattari are leading us on a path that might not be quite as emancipatory as they suggest. And that's pretty well it. If there's anything I should have said, anything more, I'd love to hear about it. I I like to pin comments that I find useful, even if they're critical, so that, people can see them. But yeah, if you have anything more, I would love to hear about it. And this is from Matt. I didn't showcase my record collection today, but I have David Bowie's Let's Dance. It's mint stuff. But anyways, take care, everyone.